Thank you for coming. It's a beautiful day outside here. You can come inside to this warm, humid place, but you're in for a treat. Since 2018, Anna Stewart has served Valparaiso University as the Assistant Dean of Christ College. Prior to that, from 2015 to 2018, she served as Assistant Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. She was stolen. This was a hostile takeover across a parking lot, and we're still getting over it. Now, Christ College is a place where students go to become Fulbright scholars. Why? Because Anna has a way of preparing our very good students to represent themselves really well. Anna, I want to embarrass you now. How many Fulbright scholars have we had since you started to work in this program? Estimate in the hundreds.
30 maybe?
30. Now, if you take a school 3 times our size with 3 times our endowment, they don't get that many Fulbrights. This is a big deal. I don't know how many of our basketball players go pro, but we've got a lot of students get Fulbrights. I doubt people know that Anna Stewart likely knows more about African American literature than anyone else on our campus. The only person who might come close to her is her husband, Samuel Brauer, Associate Professor of Humanities and Literature at Christ College. Anna earned her undergrad degree from the Honors College of the University of South Carolina. She then excelled at the University of Texas, Austin, where she earned her master's and PhD in American literature. She was a Lilly Fellow here from 2012 to 2014. By 2015, she'd gone from being a postdoctoral fellow to an assistant dean. I don't know how that happens.
Me either.
But I'm happy it did. Although that means Anna is not in the classroom as much as I think all of us wish she were. I think she wishes she were in the classroom more. I almost had to break into her office, crack open her computer, and steal her CV, which she only sent me last night at 10:30. With a note I'm going to read to you about her work with the Fulbright students.
I was falling asleep when I wrote that, so.
Anna writes, from a professional and personal standpoint, I'm especially grateful to be a fellow traveler with students during a major developmental stretch of their lives. It's a gift to know and hold their stories. Better still when I get to be part of the conversations about what they see in these stories and how they tell them. I love working with Fulbright applicants and others in this process of self-discovery, reflection, and narration. It connects back to the work and research I did around agency and empowered storytelling in marginalized communities. And there's a through line to the way art creates space for these meditations, inviting us into conversations about identity, power, and beauty. These conversations are richer because we bring varied perspectives and experiences into them. That's Anna. Samuel Graber earned his undergraduate degree from St. Olaf College in Minnesota, God's country. His MA in religion at Yale, at Yale, you've heard of Yale, and an MA and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Iowa. Sam was selected a Lilly postdoctoral fellow in 2008. Luckily, we were able to keep him around as a visiting professor until 2012, when we could offer him a tenure-track position in which he has thrived, and we're all better for it. Sam is a resident expert on transatlantic understandings of the American Civil War. He's published extensively on Walt Whitman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Herman Melville, on abolitionist writings, on Civil War monuments. But my sense is that we know him around here as an incredible teacher, as a leader and public servant of this university community. I had to write on the back the name of his book, published in 2019 by University of Virginia Press. The title is Twice Divided Nation, National Memory, Transatlantic News, and American Literature in the Civil War Era. Now you know about Sam's range. I'm going to stop now because I don't want to steal their thunder or any of their time. I'm really appreciative you're here. Could you give a nice warm applause to Anna, Stewart, and Samuel Graber?
So thank you, John, and thank you all for coming. I don't know if John mentioned that we're actually married. That maybe is...
I don't normally call my colleagues babe.
Right. They're going to pick up on it eventually. So, I did want to say one other thing about our shared sort of commitment to Christ College, which also comes out of our training in graduate school. Both of us, I think, consider ourselves interdisciplinary scholars primarily. And so we have a real commitment to sort of looking around the edges of the disciplines to sort of figure out how other things can fit together. And that, I think, will come across a little bit today in our discussion of images, in part because we're going to try to bring in a couple of poems. Yeah?
Mike, too.
Oh, sorry.
Mike in your mouth.
Okay, got it. We're going to use a couple of poems at a couple of spots, and we may even, if the technology provides, have a very short a musical number as a way of sort of thinking about how artistic imagery, like the materials that you see behind us, are always working in conjunction with other kinds of texts that are floating around in a wider culture. So that's just a sort of maybe a warning, but also a little promo from what we're going to try to do as we proceed. I don't know, did you need to?
Well, I was just going to say really quickly that we're going to be focusing on a couple of the really amazing Black artists who are featured here at the Brauer. But we decided, I mean, there's so many different directions you can take with the collection here because it has such an amazing range. We wanted to focus our chat today on Black personhood and understandings of identity. Thinking about portraiture as a lens into thinking about identity, individual identity, and also communal identity, particularly through family. So it may seem odd, but as a counterpoint, we're actually going to start with this painting from 1852. One of the points that Sam and I were thinking about when we were putting together this talk is the way that we often, you know, as an audience can sometimes read race into any painting that isn't a white body. But white bodies, we don't think about the racial implications. And so we actually wanted to start with a white family. That's a very famous painting here at the Brauer, as then sort of as a way into thinking about all of the different ways that race and identity and memory show up in just a couple of these amazing pieces of art.
So my PhD was actually in American Studies, and in that particular field, we think a lot about questions of American identity and how they've been problematic, and how they often refer to sort of categories, images, ideas, that maybe aren't as inclusive or descriptive of actual historical realities as they should be. And in some ways, I think we can think about certain visions of the family as part of that problem. It's not to say that they don't have strengths, but if you think, for instance, about a kind of stereotypical version of the 1950s, we're going to think about something like a suburban home, a white picket fence, right? You can sort of have this image in your mind that's floating around all the time as a sort of background norm. I think this version, and this is not the 1950s, but the 1850s, Henry Sanderson's Steel family portrait, which was produced in 1852. This, in a way, might be the 19th century version of that kind of picture of a family. As you can tell from the faces, it's a pretty warm and congenial, welcoming sort of image that we have here, right? It's a cozy image. If you're thinking about the Steele family in particular, we could think about this as an image of a family that's living in a rural environment. In the background, we can see a painting of a prosperous farm, which is theirs, which is a sort of painting within a painting. It could potentially be a window, but I think it's pretty clear that it's a painting. We can see a sort of version of a multi-generational family. So it's not necessarily just the nuclear version. We have a couple of different generations going on here. with the original immigrants from England on the edges, and then the other two generations sort of in the middle, although this little girl is not cooperating. She's making sure she's blazing her own trail. What you have here then are some English immigrants who came across to Pennsylvania, where this particular farm was located, and became landholders fairly quickly. You also will notice down here, I don't know if you can tell, but you can probably guess from the gilded edges there, the book that's in front of him is the Bible. And it's open in a way that sort of suggests that this is sort of a Christian patriarch, but also a family that's sort of invested in this sort of Christian identity. And for all of these reasons, I think we can think about this as a sort of warm version of an 1850s account of what we sometimes imagine as a happy suburban environment in the 1950s. But just like the 1950s version of the American family that we might all have sometimes floating around in the background of our culture, needs to be complicated a little bit by thinking beyond that picket fence to some of the other stuff that was happening, and in particular, how other kinds of families, and especially African-American families in that particular period, at the tail end of the Jim Crow era, were being subjected to all sorts of problematic oppressive systems. So we can think about the era of the white picket fence chronologically as the era of school segregation, bus boycotts, school and church bombings, police dogs and water hoses trained on kids. All of these images, I think, are also floating in the background of our imagination. But when we're thinking about the 50s, I think sometimes it can almost seem like they're two different planets. And it can sort of take an active imagination to force ourselves to think about those two sets of images as overlapping, as part of the same country. To be able to think that, yes, all of this is also in the picture all the time of that particular history. So I think what I'm suggesting here is that we need a kind of similar leap of imagination to think beyond the frame of this particular image of the Steele family, to think about what's outside that very cozy sort of picture. And if we did look beyond it, you might ask, well, what would we see? What we would see is that the sort of peaceful domestic bliss inside the frame is actually taking place across a backdrop of an America that's just emerged out of an international war, more or less of choice, and that it was now proceeding as a country under the Compromise of 1850. This is sort of interesting in relationship to the Steeles because they had arrived in the United States in 1819, right when the United States was about to enact one of its major compromises with the institution of slavery, the Missouri Compromise. And what was going to then end up happening was that over the course of their very successful endeavors in Pennsylvania, within just 2 years before this particular painting was produced to sort of show their success as an American family, the United States had made another major compromise with the institution of slavery, the Compromise of 1850. There were a lot of different outcomes of that Compromise of 1850, but one of the major ones was that it had strengthened the fugitive slave law in a way that meant that Northerners, who otherwise would have thought of themselves as very distant from any kind of problems associated with slavery, suddenly were going to be directly implicated in it, in part because they would be required in many areas to actually participate in the recovery of fugitives. So if an enslaved person happened to show up in your backyard, suddenly you had a legal responsibility as a U.S. citizen to participate in efforts to return that person to an enslaved state. And that created this whole new dynamic for what this particular environment felt like for people like the Steele family. It brought slavery home to a lot of people who had thought that they were pretty distant from it. Now this is maybe especially interesting because this particular family, geographically speaking, was not at all distant from the slave system. This farm is literally on the Mason-Dixon line. The township in which these folks were registered is right at the edge, the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania. And so within a few miles, maybe even a stone's throw, what you would have ended up running into was a slave system. So for all sorts of reasons, I think this particular image, which we originally might approach and just sort of think of it as a very cozy, generic sort of domestic image, is actually the one that when we put it within a history, starts to look like it's more complicated and interesting outside the frame as well as inside it. So that's our first sort of suggestion. And then Anna's going to tell, I think, a little bit more about why some of this consciousness of the slave system would have spread well beyond Pennsylvania.
So also outside of the frame, as it were, but very much part of sort of the cultural water in which the Sanderson, or the Steele family is swimming, would have been the rise of anti-slavery literature in the United States. So the same year that this painting was produced was the year that Frederick Douglass famously gave his speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." It's a pretty pointed speech to give on July 4th, and not inaccurate. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a famous writer of the 19th century. Her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, would move from periodical to print fiction in the same year that this painting was made. And that book, there's only one book in the United States that would outsell her book, and it was this one, the Bible.
Yeah.
So this was very much a part of the larger cultural milieu in which the painting is produced. This wasn't something you didn't know about or could escape from. This was very much something Americans were increasingly thinking about. And because of the rise of the anti-slavery literature, because of the Compromise of 1850 and the political implications, it meant that increasingly people were having to try to reckon with the fact that their government was making its peace with a system they might have had complicated feelings about. It also means that increasingly your awareness of what a family system meant and your own privilege in that system was something that was harder to deny. And that is how a lot of the anti-slavery literature operated. To our modern 21st century ears, it sometimes can feel a little grating, a little syrupy, but it's important to remember that a lot of that literary register was about forcing people to think about things they took for granted, like familial bonds, like relationships, were predicated on things that other people were being denied. As another sort of literary connection to this painting, in 1852, the same year this painting was made, there was a young black woman named Frances Watkins, and she had taken up residence less than 50 miles from this farm. So she's in the neighborhood, as it were. Like Frederick Douglass, Watkins was also a native of Baltimore. And unlike Douglass, she had been free to leave Baltimore, and she had traveled north for a teaching job a year before this painting was made. But Maryland had just passed a new state law stipulating that any free black person returning from the north would be sold into slavery if they ever returned. So she was essentially separated from her family by the passage of that state law. So she responded to the situation with her pen. She became one of the most important anti-slavery writers and equal rights advocates of her era. She worked on the Underground Railroad, which its central hub was in Philadelphia with William Still, also close to not far from this farm, which is in Westchester, just outside of Philly. And she traveled on abolitionist speaking tours and published a lot of prose and poems, some of which she credited one of her influential figures was Harriet Beecher Stowe. So I'd like to, as we're sort of transitioning to thinking about some of the other portraiture here, I actually want to read one of the poems that Watkins famously wrote, and I've actually included that. That was one that we circulated just before our talk began, called The Slave Mother. And again, keep in mind what I said about sometimes 19th century poems can read as a little bit almost corny, but I think you need to, we want to try to keep in mind the rhetorical, the pathos that she's trying to communicate in this poem with the limited means she has to make an argument against a system that doesn't recognize her. So this is The Slave Mother. Heard you that shriek? It rose so wildly on the air. It seemed as if a burdened heart was breaking in despair. Saw you those hands so sadly clasped, the bowed and feeble head, the shuddering of that fragile form, that look of grief and dread. Saw you the sad imploring eye, its every glance was pain, as if a storm of agony were sweeping through the brain. She is a mother pale with fear, her boy clings to her side, and in her cradle vainly tries his trembling form to hide. He is not hers. although she bore for him a mother's pains. He is not hers, although her blood is coursing through his veins. He is not hers, for cruel hands may rudely tear apart the only wreath of household love that binds her breaking heart. His love has been a joyous light that o'er her pathway smiled, a fountain gushing ever new amid life's desert wild. His lightest word has been a tone of music round her heart, their lives a streamlet, bent and one. Oh, Father, must they part? They tear him from her circling arms, her last and fond embrace. Oh, nevermore may her sad eyes gaze on his mournful face. No marvel then, these bitter shrieks disturbed the listening air. She is a mother, and her heart is breaking in despair.
So again, as Anna said, sometimes teaching this kind of 19th century poem can be a little bit challenging with 21st century students. When I teach this, and Anna teaches this sometimes to students in African American literature or elsewhere, the response is kind of that it's a little flat, it's a little sing-songy, it's got a little of that sort of syrupy sense to it. But students also are interested in the ways in which maybe it doesn't quite convey what they think probably the horror of slavery actually encompassed. In other words, it falls a little short. And again, this is partly a question of convention, what an audience was ready to listen to or read. In terms of the poetic conventions, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass is going to come out in a couple years, and it's going to break all of those conventions of line and meter, and people aren't even going to recognize it as poetry, many of them. They're going to be scandalized by that kind of movement. For our students who are more used to modern poetry, sometimes going back to this kind of rhymed and political verse ends up being kind of challenging. So we do things to sort of think this through with them. One would be to think about it in relationship, for instance, to the appeal that's being made. If you're thinking about this as a poem that's potentially for an audience like the Steele family, what's trying to be communicated is the idea that this little one could just be torn out of the picture, right? And when you think about it in those terms as a sort of direct appeal to family, as Anna was, I think, getting across, you can sort of see how this could work, at least on a 19th century audience. For a 21st century audience, I think it's probably easier to have additional materials, and so we're actually going to turn this picture around now. And I'm going to give you this for a second. Just, he said I was supposed to keep this from falling over. I don't know if I'm up for the job.
We've rehearsed this a couple times. Amanda, how we, perfect, a little bit further, like that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. Want to tip it?
No, I think that's
No, I'm wondering, for the people,
Oh.
it gives us a glare.
Yeah,
Do you want me to do this?
You can go further this way, or you can go further.
I can tip it.
Do you want to push it forward, or should
I think she was saying-
No, it just,
Push to the right side back a little
the
bit.
right side back, okay? Like that.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
You're on.
Thanks. So this is Alison Sarr's Cotton Eater 2. I think that this is the kind of image that can add a little bit more, maybe, if we're willing to look at it, to the sense of a kind of horror or grotesque element of slavery that a polite poem, even if it's on an emotional subject, maybe doesn't quite get across. But I wonder whether you could start just by asking you, your first impressions. Once we swung this around and sprung this on you, what kinds of visual elements jump out at you as being most striking, just in the way that this image is composed? And I guess I'm asking the people who are physically present here.
The eyes,
Yeah, great. So what about the eyes?
well, they just stand out so starkly on the face.
Yes, right. So the eyes, yeah? Yeah, they look hollow, right? And again, I think this is, we look for the eyes, right? If you think about the previous image, we're trying to make a connection with images in a painting like this. And it's tough with this one, because there isn't anything there. It seems like an absence. Anything else? Yeah.
I noticed two things I didn't say.
Yeah.
First of all, I think those are cotton balls that she's holding, and the one at her lips.
That's correct. So these are cotton bowls.
So
And up here
obviously
too.
there's a lot of implications packed in there. And the other thing, of course, is that her dress is extremely sheer.
Yes.
By the
Yeah, she's wearing a garment, but it doesn't really do much. Yeah,
Sam?
yeah.
The people who are zooming won't hear your comments, so if you could
Oh,
repeat.
I'm sorry, okay.
No, I want
Yeah.
to interchange.
So the cotton was one of the comments, and I think Rachel was saying there's a lot there, which is true, right? It's not just a lot of cotton balls proliferating around the outside. There's also a lot to say about cotton, and I think in some ways Helsingar is trying to do that. The other point was about the dress, right? The kind of garment that doesn't actually conceal or do much work as a garment. Good.
And there was a comment about
Yeah.
the eyes. The
Yes,
left-
and I mentioned that.
Okay, great, okay.
Yeah. So these are all great. Again, one of the things that's maybe striking about this is partly because it's a kind of, it's a very limited palette in terms of colors. And because there are really strong lines, you notice the contrast, for instance, between the kind of blue-black skin of the subject and the whiteness of the eyes. And we might also associate that with the very striking image of the cotton, right, which stands out in part because it's got that sort of white color and those strong lines. So I think this is a very visually striking image. You first see it and you sort of think, what can I make of this? And then as you think about it, there's a lot there. So just to say a couple of things just in terms of both the image and sort of some of the history that I think the artist is appealing to here. We can think about this in relationship to the problem of the color line, which is a line that was made famous by W.B. Du Bois, as being something that's almost literally embraced by this image, right? It's a creation of very stark distinctions between white and dark in ways that make the lines really, really apparent. So the lines sort of become literal between that black body and the white cotton. But as Rachel said, there's a lot to be said about cotton, and this is also king cotton at this period in the 1850s. Cotton was the economic source and the rationale for white power that was exerted over black bodies. So if you think about it in relationship to what's happening in the image, there is a relationship between these little white bowls and what's happening to this large image of a person in the middle. This was the cash crop that underpinned the entire nation's slave economy, and it was empowering racial slavery right up to the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment. Harvesting this particular crop was actually a little bit difficult, and so it also seemed to disallow African American freedom as an economic necessity to many outsiders, who in a kind of monstrous way made a bargain about the black humanity that they saw in front of them, and determined that it was too expensive to acknowledge in some ways. There had to be a justification for why African Americans were being denied their freedom, and for some people the justification ended up being straight up dehumanization. And I think we see maybe some elements of that happening in this image. This kind of argument by white enslavers was almost ludicrously paradox. They had to tie themselves in knots in order to make these kinds of arguments. So for instance, white enslavers would insist on blacks' brutality in order to treat them as brutally as possible to keep them in their brutish state. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? But it was the logic of the system, a kind of monstrous logic. Literacy, the ability to read and write, was blocked actively because reading would have made enslaved people unhappy with their status as not being people. Again, it doesn't make sense. It's a kind of monstrous logic going on. And finally, Christianity, that Bible that we saw in the first image, could not be taught except in the restricted and perverted form of a pro-slavery religion. And again, all of these sorts of elements, I think, are in one way or another contributing to our image here of cotton as a kind of dehumanizing agent. It's the color of the cotton, in some ways, that then shows up in the eyes. And so we see a kind of personal economy that mirrors the national economy. She's eating the cotton, it's going into her body, and then it's performing a kind of growth function that's changing her in a way that becomes really off-putting. So the eyes, I think, here are suggesting that cotton's influence is everywhere, not just outside the body, but even inside the body. And it's lending its essence to the one who picks it. You can also maybe see some of the whiteness in some of the other places, the hands, the toenails, the teeth, as being a way of sort of pointing to a really constrained set of choices for somebody that's trapped in a picture like this. If you're inside this frame and you're a person, there doesn't seem to be anything to eat except for cotton. That's all that's there. You can see the little cotton bowls held in her left hand almost daintily. You might almost imagine that as a bouquet of flowers, right? Maybe even a wedding bouquet. But it's the perversion of the alternative, the version of it that would have actually attained in a system that was not as monstrous and dehumanizing as slavery was. Anna's going to point out one more detail as a way of raising some other important issues here.
Yeah, and I would just tie this back to the poem, right? The Watkins poem that we read a minute ago, about what's also troubling here is what is growing unseen, or is sort of seen through this this shift, that despite a garment that, you know, exposes the woman's body, we can see what seems to be the suggestion of future motherhood here in her distended womb. And the other thing that's disturbing and challenging about this is that children are also the cash crop in this picture. So they were bought and sold as a matter of course, and childbearing women were valuable profit centers because an enslaved person's legal status followed the status of the mother. So every enslaved woman who bore a child was also consigning her child to legal enslavement. And that's where that Watkins Harper line is so haunting, is that he is not hers. He is not hers. So slavery exacted an even more perverse and even paradoxical tax on black motherhood, because the children were hers, but they could never truly be hers, because they would automatically belong to whichever enslaver she was bound to, simply because she gave birth to them. And almost as troubling as the thought of that future sale is also, and separation, is also the sense that we get that this future person may also be consigned to the same system, eating the cotton like the mother. That you're also bound by a set of a lack of choices. And that this is the kind of vision, I think, that Sar's painting here, that her art really helps us get at, is seeing that wickedness, the monstrous perversion of self and family. And so think about, you know, how far we've come from where we started, from the image just on the other side of this, on the back of this, the Pennsylvania farm that was just a few miles north of the Mason-Dixon line. Switch over.
Yeah. So one of the things about this image is that I think it's undeniably a powerful image, but I think it also raises a really important problem with how artists have, and I'm thinking not just of visual artists, but also writers, also musicians. Anybody who wants to give an account of a dehumanizing system, I think, runs into a particular problem. Namely, if you do a really good job of describing or depicting a dehumanizing system, the danger is always that you lose touch with a human being whose humanity seems to be taken away by it. And I think in this case, this image might start to push in that direction. In other words, I think in some ways, this might be a really effective portrait of a dehumanizing system of enslavement. But I'm not sure it's a particularly effective portrait of an enslaved person. And so I think some artists, when they're dealing with this problem, have to make a kind of devil's bargain in some ways. If you're going to expose the devil for the evil that's there, how are you going to do so in a way that doesn't lose track of exactly how much cost has been exacted by those devilish schemes? Kara Walker here in this image, I think, is giving us a version of this too. We're not going to talk too much about this, as you can tell. This is not really a portrait. But we wanted to raise it in part because she's a very famous artist, but also because even though you have some human imagery, you can see the image of a woman underneath the water. We have an image of these sort of monstrous hands holding the boat. And then some kind of grotesque, stereotypical imagery that almost looks like it could show up on a racist lawn. So I think in a way what Walker's trying to do here is try to create a sense of unease in our apprehension of what's happening in these sorts of these systematic situations of oppression. But again, I think in some criticism of these kinds of images has to do with the fact that because they traffic in the grotesque, they sort of lose track in some ways of the human depiction that also is an important part of this kind of art. If we wanted to sort of give a contrast, I might point your attention to this one at the end. And in particular, because it's a religious image. The title of this is Solid as a Rock. My God is a rock. And so if we're looking at this particular vision by Charles White, one of the things that it might highlight for us is a different way in which religion in particular created a field for African Americans historically to be able to, on the one hand, criticize in pretty harsh terms the terrible system that was taking away their humanity, and at the same time refusing to give up that kind of humanity that they could hold on to in part because they were a people of God. And maybe not just a people of God, but maybe the chosen people of God. So often, before Harper was even writing her poems, we had a certain kind of poetry coming out of African American oral traditions, which we know as the spirituals, which were using Christianity as a reference point to help to articulate a vision of justice, but also in a more basic way, just African American personhood as something that needed to be retained. And one of the most powerful storylines for this was the association of African American enslaved people with the Israelites of Exodus. So religious music and art all over the place is going to use that story of the dehumanizing injustice of the pharaohs from the Bible and use that as a reference point for African American experience in order to draw on a kind of eternal wellspring of African American humanity. That regardless of the system around them, there was a story that said, no matter what, you are a people. You are a people of God. So partly to help to reinforce this and also to give you something to listen to as you were sort of looking closely at this image, is a spiritual. And this is Go Down Moses this one is sung by Paul Robeson. And it's actually coming out about the same time that Charles White was thinking about drawing this. So it's a song of the 50s in this particular pressing. And the album that probably of Robeson's that Charles White took his title from was produced in the same year, 1853, or 1953, excuse me, 100 years more or less after that Sanderson painting. Robeson recorded a couple of different religious albums, and one of the songs is the one you're going to hear. And the other, one of the other pressings was the basis for the title of this particular image. Okay, let's try it. Let's see if the music works.
When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. Spake the laudable Moses said, let my people go. If not, I'll smite your firstborn dead. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go.
So depending on who you ask, that was the first printed spiritual was overheard at Fortress Monroe in 1861, so early in the Civil War. But spirituals hadn't been printed and widely disseminated, and it was printed in the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which was the newspaper of record for all the different abolitionist societies that had sort of sprung up around the United States. So that was how that song was first sort of disseminated through print. The Fisk Singers in 1872 would make it famous, and they would tour internationally and sing a lot of the spirituals. So this song would rise to a new level of prominence in the Reconstruction period. But Robeson put a stamp on it, as Sam said, in 1953, which is 1 year before Brown v. Board. It's also one of the albums that White, this artist, was listening to. He said was one of his influences. And Charles White was coming out of the WPA and turning to images of race and the black body. He would start doing that more overtly and politically later in the 1950s. He'd actually eventually do a series of prints of black bodies that were deliberately meant to invoke the way that slave auction prints were printed in the 19th century. So he would move into a more and more kind of political, political thrust with his imagery. He trained with Diego Rivera in Mexico. But this woodblock comes a little bit earlier. This is, 1953. And I'm curious if you noticed any particular images or any particular details in this image that resonate with a strong sense of black personhood or peoplehood. And what do you see here?
Well, just that her feet seem very strong, it's like she has a strong foundation.
Yeah, so the comment was the feet are really prominent and seem very grounded and strong on solid ground. Yeah, great.
Strong hands.
Strong hands. Mm-hmm.
Very
Absolutely. I know it might be a little hard to see in the back, and especially probably on Zoom.
Is that a kind of African design in his clothing?
It's sort of a shift. I think it sort of evokes a servant's shift. I don't know, what do you think, Sam?
I think it's really hard to answer almost all of those questions about exactly what this is supposed to depict. I don't know how you feel or other people who've had a chance to look at this more than once. I haven't been able to come to a clear determination for myself exactly what historical situation this is, which maybe is part of the point. I don't know. I guess I've accommodated myself to the idea that I can read more than one sort of message there in terms of what the history might be. But because it's a religious image, maybe that's part of the intent.
Solid as a rock.
Yeah. Ambiguous in ways that I think are maybe important. I'm not exactly sure where gender fits, for instance, in this personally.
We went back and forth. Sam thought this was a female body. I thought it was a male body. And I also am not sure about what's at the neck. I wondered about that too. So it's sort of, it could be read as a historical portrait. It could be read as an allegory. It could be read as something in between the two. I think those are all possibilities.
So if you're thinking about this image then as a kind of a way of articulating an African-American humanity that's kind of without question, based on the other possibilities that we've seen, we can see why that's challenging. I think this last one, the image by Romero Bearden, The Family, is taking us back into a kind of mysterious, almost winking resistance to disclosure. So there's a couple of really weird things about this image. I don't know if you can pick up on them from the distance, but look closely at the details here. You may see some things that are kind of surprising, especially if you look at the left-hand corner of the picture. A lot of nodding heads. Do you guys see what that is? The very background, right over here. Can you see that? It's the form of a nude. A nude. The other thing that I think is really weird is right here. In almost the dead center, just right of center, you'll see what certainly looks like a part of a frontal shot of an eye. but it's only one. It's almost like it's peeking around a corner. So this, to me, suggests a kind of weird theme or subplot of an image that's called the family, which is a kind of peeping Tom almost, or voyeur, along with a nude form in the back that you might associate with something like a nude in a museum, right? Or maybe even a pornographic image. And neither of these, to me, seems to have much business in a family portrait. It's odd that this is called the family, it has a subject matter that looks like the family, and then it has that other element. So I was thinking about this a lot, and one of the things that I think we might be able to take away from that is that one of the things that happens once we notice a detail like that is that we suddenly become implicated as viewers, right? Otherwise, you're standing in front of a painting and you're kind of just trying to get information. But if you look at something that makes you a little uncomfortable, like a nude, or even the image of someone else looking sort of in an odd way, you start to worry about how you're looking at things, right? You wonder if, ooh, did anybody see me look too closely at that picture, right? And I think that in some ways that's a position that maybe Romare Bearden wanted to put us in. He wanted us to think about exactly what we're looking for when we look at his image called The Family. I also think about another text that I teach in a class called Word and Image, which comes out of the 70s, like this painting, by a famous sort of art critic who was on the BBC for a while, a guy named John Berger, who talks about nudes as a form. And one of the things that he said is the nude is condemned to never be naked. The nude is condemned to never be naked. By which I think he means that the nude is a pose. You look like you're taking off all your clothes, but in some ways you're just putting on a pose. And so there's a way in which what that does is take away the possibility that you're going to actually be able to project or present an authentic person. So even though it looks like you're disclosing a lot, you're actually not. It's a costume. So I think if we're thinking about that kind of image, that kind of looking and that kind of presentation, one of the things we might think a little bit about in relationship to African American history and the presentation of this particular family are the ways in which certain kinds of families, not just African American families, but lots of different kinds of families, often working class families, what we might think of as oppressed in any number of ways, but who were sometimes romanticized as having a certain kind of rustic appeal. So we might think of a genre painting in the European scene, or we might think about the way that certain kinds of photographs of even oppressed people in depression in some ways articulate a kind of rustic version of authenticity, right? That's real something. And I think that this has been true for African American families historically. There's a long history of especially white viewers looking for a kind of authenticity in African American culture. So we might think about, for instance, the Uncle Remus stories, which were written down by Joel Chandler Harris, but presented by Harris as his overheard conversations of quote-unquote authentic African American enslaved or formerly enslaved people. And then sort of promoted in those terms as a kind of authentic articulation of what it was to be from that particular community. This didn't stop with the sort of post-slavery days. If you think about the oral history projects, which are really, really important, stories of African American formerly enslaved people that were recorded and then transcribed in the middle of the 20th century during the Great Depression as part of a government project. It was really important to get that information. These stories would have disappeared without it. But in the Library of Congress, they show up under folklore. In part because there's a way that seemed like the place that you would put that really crucial information. And so I think part of what maybe Romare Bearden as an African-American artist is maybe trying to get across is that there's an inevitable necessity to mask, to cover up, because there's something about that viewer looking for authenticity that is intrusive and exploitive, and maybe not actually as comfortable with what the reality would be as you might think based on their supposed interests. So in this particular image, I think we can see a lot of different versions of something like masking. And I think Anne is going to point out a couple of them here, and then read a poem that is all about masking as our final statement.
So we're wrapping. We're in the home stretch here, folks. But yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of come full circle from the Sanderson family portrait that we started with, which was traditional in a lot of ways, and then thinking about how Bearden is sort of playing with our audience expectations somewhat. And as Sam was saying, you see, like, this figure looks almost like a child. There's someone peeking out from behind, so there's a mask here. It's hard to tell what exactly you're looking at. And even the fact, we also have this, is it a window, is it a painting, sort of reminiscent of the Sanderson family portrait as well. You notice how some of the painting, some of the hues here are sort of picked up in the individuals in the painting as well, some of those same color palettes. Is it supposed to be nature or someone's idea of nature? And what about the people themselves? So I think there is a lot of masking. There's a lot of concealment going on in this piece of art. And with the nude, as Sam pointed out, there's revelation, but then you're not sure what you can read into the revelation or if that's part of the mask. So I'd like to close with a really famous poem by a Black poet, Paul Laurence Dunbar. Every time I've taught Black Lit, if you can't teach Black Lit, do not teach this poem, right, John? Yeah. So this will be our final thing, and then we're happy to hang out a little bit if folks want to talk or have questions. We wear the mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies, that hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and now with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask.
Questions? If you have a question, ask it, and then Sam or Anna will repeat it for the Zoomers. Okay?
I don't know if I missed the date of this meeting.
This is 1975.
1975.
Yeah, sorry, 1975. Great.
On this painting, I just wanted to ask you, so cotton is the material that makes clothes, but she has clothes that don't work.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you thought that was part of.
That's
Do you
great.
want to repeat the question?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the question, which was really just a great insight, cotton is a material that's going to be used to make clothes. But the other insight is that she's wearing clothes that don't really work. And again, I think there's so much that you could say about this. It's absolutely, I think, there. If you're thinking about how cotton becomes cloth, it was an international trade. So a lot of the cotton was being bought in Great Britain and going into the textile mills there in order to become the cloth that helped to finance the buying of future children, if you're thinking about the slave economy. But if you think about one of the most consistent things that African-American slave narratives will talk about, life under slavery, clothes were a big theme, and they were never enough. They would not spend that money necessarily on actual adequate clothing. And there was an assumption that enslaved people were not necessarily going to live that long. So it was all factored into the economy. It was how you figured out the cost of doing the business. And for a lot of enslavers, having more than one or two sets of clothes was too much to expect. So having something threadbare, even though I think there are lots of other reasons that might not be purely sort of historically or depicted, to have it that way, I think that's definitely a really important angle on this. I had not thought of that, but I absolutely think that's right.
And I was just going to comment, that's a really good point too about the politicization of things that we just sort of can take for granted, like cotton. I mean, that was one of the things too that anti-slavery folks became increasingly uncomfortable with was, cotton rags. And what are the books printed on sometimes? So even when you're sometimes trying to fight against a system, you yourself can be using materials to fight the system that are coming out of the system. So it gets really complicated really quickly. As I look, that's a really powerful point too about the way that clothing or materials, even when trying to be weaponized, are bound up in the same problematic system.
I just make one comment. I had a group, when I worked here, I had a group of girls from a home where they were taken in, lived with counselors and things like that, and not being able to be with their families.
Yeah, I'll pass the mic so you can be heard.
Okay, I was getting a tour to some girls who were living elsewhere than their homes for certain reasons, and if they were on good behavior, they could come to the museum on Friday for a tour. And I wasn't even going to talk about that, because it's a difficult pain. These are high school girls. And they went right up to it, and they just sighed and stepped back and just took it all in. And they said, oh my gosh, she is so vulnerable. Look at what she's wearing. She's so vulnerable. And they got a whole, I mean, you were going to learn the historical side of these girls, given that what they were going through, just saw her and related to her, and just could feel with such a strong you know.
While I have the mic, is it also possible that she's eating the cotton because she's starving?
Sure.
That the protrusion, that you could see her as either pregnant or starving or both.
Yeah, I think your comment was, it's the only thing that keeps her alive. Yeah, yeah. Again, within the frame, this is what you might have to choose. One of the great resources for this, Anna has published on Harriet Jacobs' narrative. It's called Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl. And this is one of Jacobs' real achievements and also most difficult tasks as a writer, is to try to articulate what it was like to be a girl under slavery. And she's just trying to hit her readers over the head who are too genteel to hear some of the language that she might have used otherwise, but trying to explain exactly how vulnerable you would be as a girl growing up under slavery. And as a girl, she was somebody who was subjected to repeated threats of rape, and she figured out a way around it by having a quote-unquote adulterous affair with another male suitor before the guy could fully enact his malevolent schemes. But when she's trying to explain that situation to an audience, for instance, of white northern women, how do you explain that choice? Right? All of these people have Bibles. All of these people are thinking about sin. But how do you explain how you have to make a certain kind of choice that's constrained like that? There's nothing else to eat. You can't make a full choice about who you're going to marry. There was no such thing. You can't have marriages in a situation where it's going to be economically beneficial to separate families consistently. That's not going to work in that economic system. So I think, again, the kind of witness of a kind of vulnerability is, again, it doesn't surprise me that there was a kind of pull of this, in part because it just tears you up a little bit.
One more question? There's a question.
Yeah, Nathan.
Yeah, I've looked at the image on, I know you guys can go over it too in detail, the image on the right, but you briefly mentioned the woman in the water. So I was wondering, like, what is your guys' interpretation of the woman in the water? Because it seems to me like some kind of darker side that's stuck in the water.
Yeah. Well, so the title of this is No World, not New World, No World. So I think I read it as a commentary on the middle passage, right? So you have the ship here, you have these hands, these forces that are sort of, you're bound, again, sort of similar to the commentary of being bound up in a system where you have constrained choices. I mean, the ships brought a lot of slaves to the Americas, but a lot of people never got to the Americas. There's a lot of death in the water. So my reading of that figure is that it is dark, it's mournful. It's a reminder of the life that can't be, the worlds that can't exist. And the caricatures, sort of here, I think those kind of cutouts are something that Kara Walker is pretty well known for. John maybe knows more
Silhouettes.
about it. Yeah, silhouettes, yeah.
Yeah, she gets in a lot of trouble with her own community because these are powerful, stereotypical images. I see the one on the left as a version of Topsy. Not Harriet Beecher Stowe's Topsy, but the Topsy that comes out of the stage play, that becomes
Yeah.
a comic, amoral figure about which life is a joke. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and these figures of the 19th century minstrelsy, so that tradition where, black bodies were on stages, but as a source of comic relief and sort of being reduced to gross stereotypes. And when you would see the stage bills or the plays advertising those shows,
And
the
they're holding
figures
the
would
cut,
look
they
like.
got the cotton too.
Yeah, yeah. But it's no world. Yeah.
But you haven't mentioned the hands, and that was the first thing I saw.
Yeah, yeah.
Thinking that this evil force in the darkness is enabling the ship to come to the shore.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, the ship, everyone is in a system that sort of doesn't have complete power or control. Yeah, so I don't know how to make it all fit together, but I see some of those themes and threads for you wanting to speak.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't know how well everybody can see, but it doesn't actually fit together.
Yeah,
There's
it's not her hands.
It's something like a refracted image, so there's distance between where her arms are and the surface of the water and then these arms.
Yeah.
So to me, at least, it's not necessarily the idea that
Yeah,
this
I don't think it's
is
her,
the
it's
shape
not, I don't think it's her
holding it up.
hands. Yeah.
But it could be. I mean, I really think, again, we have to figure out what to make of this. And I don't think it's clear.
One more question.
What do you make of the ship's rigging? Because she seems to be rigged all wrong, and the draft is much too low for no, I'm serious. I mean, I'm not a ship guy by any stretch of the definition, but she looks rigged more like a dhow, a ship on the Red Sea, or the Persian Gulf than anything. You see her trafficking between Zanzibar and Arabia, not between. That would never survive the Atlantic crossing.
No, I agree. I don't think it's a realistic ship at all. I don't know that that necessarily means that it isn't about the Middle Passage. But I think that the Middle Passage also is not just a historical event. It's this sort of elevated way of talking about a certain kind of inhumanity. The scale is such that you can almost not imagine it. And so sometimes art needs to take us in a sort of quasi-realistic relationship to that history so that we can help to sort of imagine what otherwise would just look like a statistic. How many were lost? Those are lives, right?
What about that, huh? Thank you very, very much. Anna, your parents were zooming in?
I don't know,
Say
Sam's-
hi, say hello, Sam.
Sam's parents are. I don't know, my mom might be on, I'm not sure.
We hope so.
They live far away.
Anyway, we're back here at the same time, next Thursday. View students, it'll be View Women, talking about women artists representing women. Images you haven't seen yet, and hope you can come back. It's also the day celebrating student scholarship, and so there'll be stuff going on around campus, so get on the website to see what else is going on. 2 weeks from now, Mike Loggins, Kenny Loggins, Mike Loggins and Barath Gagash will be here. 2 geographers taking over the collection. So, and that's at 5 o'clock, because we have a faculty meeting we've got to go to before we come here. The last one of the year, and it's important we do our jobs. So come here at 5 in 2 weeks, 4 next week. And thanks very much for being here, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Enjoy the weather.